Alrighty.
Okay, should
Um,
be all good.
all right, I'll go ahead and share screen. Um, so at least good to see a nice group today. And first of all, at least just to say thanks to Kevin for inviting me. It's good to connect with him when we ran into each other in Minneapolis a couple months ago, and got the opportunity to come and talk here and really to talk about fabric lessons from year one. It's at least what I call the talk, generally speaking. Um, In case you're not familiar with me, my name is Jared Kuehn. I'm a senior for a company called Heartland Business Systems. We're a consulting firm primarily based out of the Midwest, although we do work outside of that geography. Pretty much anything Microsoft products we work in, and also physical infrastructure we do quite a bit. Being Midwestern based, as you could probably hear, I have the Midwestern accent. So if you ever need that Midwestern accent turned up a little bit, just let me know. I can add in some oofdas and oy veys and oh no, that's wrong dialect. Um, Me personally, I've been working in the data industry for about well over a decade now. Most of that's been in consulting. Most of that has been with Microsoft products. I have certifications for those who have interest in them, including the Fabric certification, at least the one that's currently published. Waiting for the other one to come out of beta right now. More importantly, some of the things I think you should know about me that helps explain what you'll probably see for the rest of today is I'm kind of a weirdie, and I prefer being that way because Weird Al Yankovic is my hero. Not only because he's well known for his parody songs and all of that, but because he's a storyteller. He's really good at sharing information through narration. And that's the same sort of thing I try to strive for as a presenter is we look back at the history of humanity and really the way that we've shared information from the beginning was through storytelling. So with tonight's session and talking about fabric, I'd like to tell you a story, and hopefully, you learn a thing or two from it. And obviously, this is a picture that is me and is not AI generated. Don't pay attention to that bottom part. Uh, so the agenda for this session is pretty light, and I'll say, as far as communications, questions, talking about things, this is a session that I like to have more interactivity with things. So for people who especially have worked with Fabric up until this point, I'm going to certainly give you some thoughts, some tips, some tricks that I've learned with Fabric over the past year. I'd welcome your thoughts on it too, because the product's only been around for a first year, and we've already had different experiences within that time. To try and keep things fun and lighthearted, I have a rating system which is clearly scientific and has no bias built into it whatsoever. But it's to try and take a look at things feature by feature and say, how is this product really working well today? What areas are going well? What areas are not? Towards the end, then we'll open up the floor and at least just talk about what are people hoping to see out of the product for year two and beyond? What needs to change in this product in order to see it really grow into what this product I think does have the potential to be if given enough years and community involvement. Q&A I've listed at the end, but certainly I'll be going feature by feature by feature. So if you have any questions related to a specific feature that I bring up, by all means, ask those questions as you have them, either in chat or pipe up and with your microphones. I'd be happy to answer any questions you have as you have them. And obviously, at least the big asterisk here, fabric is a large thing. We could be here all night and probably into tomorrow morning talking about all the features. So a lot of what I'll be talking about today is some of the more, I'll call it mainstream features, or at least ones that I've seen more actively talked about in the industry. So, year one of Fabric, it's in the books. All right. If you go at least by the formal date of um, Fabric being formally announced as being generally available November of 2023, it's finally hit its first birthday. Happy birthday celebrations. We want to start building that baby book of what was Fabric like within that first year. And that's a lot of at least what today is going to be about. What does that baby book look like? Now, to set a couple of guardrails here, I'm going to be coming in here again talking about various features and at least some, again, tips, recommendations that I would have if you're looking to utilize these particular sections of Fabric. What I'm going to recommend today is going to be based on a couple of assumptions. First of all, it's based on my own personal research and experience. So I've worked actively in the product in production environments for the past year. I've gotten certified on the solution. I've also done extensive research as I've had time on various facets of it, but still my knowledge is finite. So I will certainly answer to things the best that I can, but I may not have a complete list of everything because, again, fabric is humongo. Second thing I'm going to say too is some of the things I'm going to advocate for are based on design principles that I typically advocate for any organization when you're approaching your architecture and your design of your data solutions. But like any design solution, it has its pros, it has its cons. And if you take a look at it from a different lens or with different priorities in mind, what I share with you today might disagree with your viewpoint. And if so, that's fine. This is not intended to be heavy-handed or anything. It is just my perspective on it based on the principles that I typically advocate for. And I'd love to hear at least other people if they have a different design principle and head to a different conclusion as a result. Now, I also mentioned that we're going to have a rating system tonight. So again, completely scientific, not any sort of bias or anything in here whatsoever. It's going to be a basic three rating system. It's going to be either a tag, so I'm going to give each feature a tag, an RFI, or a BTH. Tag means things are great, especially for it being first year of a product. This part of the solution works great. It's something that I think you can go in, jump in, and you're going to have a really good experience with it. RFI means if you go in it with the right idea in mind, you're probably going to have a really good implementation of it. But in certain situations, it might not work really well for what you're looking to do. And then finally, BTH, bad things do happen with technology. And that's not to say that it's, oh gosh, Microsoft is awful and such. This isn't that type of presentation. Yes, some things about Fabric aren't great, but some things are really awesome. And so we're going to try and use this rating system to at least talk about this. And Kevin, I know you've talked about this particular topic too. So if you disagree at least with anything that I put ratings on here, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that too, based on your experiences too.
I will shout loudly.
Sounds good. So that's our three system for ratings. So with that, don't worry, Fabric. We're going to be nice about this and we're going to have fun with it tonight. All right. So we need to start at the very beginning that we start with when talking about any sort of product. And that starts with the financial side of it, money, licensing. So I'm going to really ask the question of what does Fabric look like for a user base to make sure they can understand the licensing model that Fabric has available, giving that a rating of either tag, RFI, or BTH. Not sure at least what Kevin's thoughts are going to be, but as far as understanding licensing in the industry, I hate to start this way, but I'm going to have to start with a BTH on this. And I think really bad things happen when it comes to licensing. And I'll tell you why. In the experiences that I've had in the past year, I've had a lot of conversations with many organizations about Fabric. And two things consistently hold true when I have these conversations. One, people hear about all of these things that Fabric can do, and they're super excited about it. Second thing that holds true, nobody understands how the licensing model works. And and there's two points of contention that consistently come up for that. So I want to take some time here and make sure for everybody on the call, let's at least clarify these two things in case there's any confusion about it. First thing is when talking about Fabric, where does your Power BI licensing fit in? And the answer is for pretty much any implementation of Fabric, you do have to have some Power BI per user licensing in play. Where things get confusing is which SKU requires your viewers to have licenses. And the answer there is in the graphic. I have this from the Microsoft site, Microsoft Learn. The red section on the bottom talks about it. SKUs that are smaller than F64 require Pro or Premium per user license or a Power BI individual trial to consume Power BI content. That's talking about your viewers, but just your viewers. Your developers in pretty much any situation are still going to need Power BI per user licensing. So the only thing that changes is F64 or higher, your viewers now get a license that really comes from the capacity, not from having per user licensing. Now, some of you sitting on the call, if you've worked in Power BI for some time, you might say, well, yes, this is Power BI premium capacity licensing as it has been for many years. And you're right. But I think at least the amount of confusion I've seen in the industry about this shows what percentage of the market hasn't worked with that model yet and finds it really confusing. Because, like, we're talking M365 for the Power BI licensing, and then Fabric comes in here somewhere, but it's not managed in M365, it's managed elsewhere. So, first thing at least we have to set is Power BI per user licensing is going to be needed in most, if not all, cases of Fabric. And Amon, yes, depending on the SKU, you only get a fraction of a core. How exactly they provision that on the back end, I'm not quite sure how exactly that works, but the lower SKUs only give you a percentage of a V core, which is very interesting to me. So that's at least one common misconception I've seen about licensing. The other thing that comes up is what is the Fabric capacity itself? And at least to be clear about this, Fabric capacity is an Azure resource. It's not a license. It's something that you provision in an Azure tenant. And then having that provisioned, that's when you start incurring the cost, same as you do with other Azure resources. So again, taking a look at the full life cycle of trying to understand Fabric licensing means I need to understand Power BI licensing on the M365 side. I need to understand Azure tenants and how that works and being able to provision it, not only to include the Power BI tenant, which is then when you need to apply the Fabric capacity to it. And it's just really confusing. It's so spread out. And that's at least why I give it a BTH, is I think that there's a lot of confusion here. And right now, the licensing model is when you work in it long enough, it makes sense. But to get people started on a software as a service offering, I think it could be simplified. And I think that would be something that I would encourage if I had the chance to talk to the Fabric product team and give any advice on that is I think we need to come up with some better avenues here because in this current state, I could see this consistently becoming an issue as time continues. So that's at least the licensing side. Now, the next step after we get into licensing is let's talk about setting up the environment. So, getting an initial implementation up and running of Fabric. What does that look like? What do I give that for a rating? That I'm actually going to shift to the other side of our rating system, tag. I think things are great here because I'll say, at least consistently from my experience, it is really just as simple as provisioning that capacity in your Azure tenant and applying it to workspaces. It's a two-step process, and then potentially some extra ones if you don't already have your Power BI licenses already established. I've had it consistently where to get this up and running to the point that you can start doing functional things in Fabric, half an hour or less, which for a SaaS offering is the sort of thing I would expect to see. Quick and easy to get it up and running, once at least you understand the licensing. But like any solution, okay, so it's really easy to get up and running. Are there any things we should think about when talking about getting the environment up and running that quickly? Two things at least I'd encourage people to think about if you are early on in your journey and you're trying to get started with Fabric. First thing is beware information overload. If you're like me and you open up that new item list, I kid you not, for me, I take a look at that and all I see is this. I see a Star Wars logo-esque scroll that is just feature after feature after feature, and you can just hear the music right now. Da 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 da. Hey, I can store data. Now I can prepare data. And it just kind of goes on and on and on and on and on. So where do you start? Well, we know the whole too many cooks in a kitchen, and if you take 50 cooks and you tell them to make a burger in a kitchen, what do you get? You probably get about 40 burgers and 10 people who decided, you know what, I'm going to make this thing. It's basically a salad, but I'm going to call it a burger and it fits the requirements, right? So I've seen organizations head in this direction too, and that's at least just, you know, common sense on this is beware the information overload. Just because you can do everything in Fabric doesn't mean that's where you should start your journey. So typically what I'm encouraging, start with your top two solutions, build out from there. If all you're doing today is relational data and moving data with low code, no code solutions like Azure Data Factory, then just build that out. Build out a Fabric warehouse and Fabric pipelines, and you don't need to touch the rest of it until you've got that foundation set. The better that foundation is, the better you're going to have a long-term implementation of Fabric, and it's going to be a whole lot easier to build off of that foundation and avoid swamping your Fabric environment, which I'd say, from things I've seen this past year, is a significant risk for many organizations. Other thing I'd say too is when you're picking out your capacity size, two things that you want to make sure of when you think about that. First is if you have interest in using Apache Spark within Fabric. Your SKU determines the cluster size that you can create. Case in point there, and I say this at least from personal experience, if you're working in an F2 SKU, so baseline SKU, and you use the default pool configuration, you can have one active Spark session at a time. That's it. If you try and start up any other sessions, you'll start getting that error message that says you've hit your capacity limit, in which case you either have to configure your clusters to allow for smaller clusters to be created, or you've got to up your SKU. So if working with notebooks and working with Spark and Fabric is something you're interested in, make sure you take a look at the guidelines there of how much or what size of cluster you can create depending on the capacity you choose. Other thing too is the semantic model storage. Again, those who have worked with Power BI premium capacity, this shouldn't come as a surprise. The semantic model storage limits still carry over from Power BI. So I think for like an F2 SKU, it's a 3 GB limit for semantic models, which knowing that an F2 SKU in one lake, I believe the limit is about 2 TB of storage. You might see at least 2 TB and say, okay, I want to head in that direction. But if you're planning on using the semantic models, then you have to compress 2 TB of data into 3 GB. And if you can do that and at least get that full compression on that, good on you for that. Um, but at least some people or some organizations I've seen get tripped up on that of they start hitting limits. They're trying to deploy Power BI reports with a data set associated to it, and they hit a limit because they hit that semantic model storage limit. So just be aware of those two things getting started with your environment. Last thing I'll talk about environments, and then we'll start talking specific features is, and I specifically broke this off from like getting the environment up and running because I needed a separate rating for this, is understanding the region consideration for Fabric. And this is another thing where I kind of have to give it a BTH. The one thing that has bitten me pretty significantly, and at least one engagement that I had this year was um, setting an organization up with Fabric in a region that will let you create the capacity in that region, but the region can't actually support what the capacity could do. So again, if you're looking to plan out your Power BI or your Fabric implementation, that reliability in Microsoft Fabric, that's a Microsoft Learn article. Take a look at that and make sure the region you want to put your Fabric capacity in will actually support the particular features of Fabric that you're looking to do. Just because you can create the capacity doesn't mean it actually supports the part of Fabric that you want to use. Obviously, as time goes on, this should get better as it gets rolled out more and more in the coming years. But for right now, this is a gotcha. And especially if we get to a point where if your Fabric capacity is in one region, your Power BI tenant is in another region, if you start encouraging cross-region costs, having having that Fabric capacity in the same region as your Power BI tenant is going to be important. And I'll tell you right now, because I went through it this year, you do not want to do a Power BI tenant migration unless absolutely necessary. I don't know, Kevin, if you run into this, but I did one this year and it was an adventure.
I've never had the pleasure of having to do one, um, but I've heard it's a pain, and it's interesting because they actually just recently started doing it. It used to be support would tell you, no, we don't even want to do it. So
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I at least had to deal with it for my experience with it this year. It was about a 2 month ordeal, and part of the fun of it was when I checked this particular diagram, it wasn't up to date with what regions do or do not support Fabric capabilities. So we migrated the tenant from one region to another, only to find out that the region we migrated to doesn't actually support Fabric yet. And then we had to migrate back.
yeah, and
It was great.
I just put the link that you referenced in the chat, and they updated it for SQL databases. And this explains why I'm not seeing it in a lot of the tenants that I have. It's not supported yet in a lot of the regions.
Yep. Yeah. Yeah, and that's the same thing I'm seeing too is they're saying that at least it's generally available. That doesn't necessarily mean it's generally available in all regions yet.
Hey, is my mic working? This is Amin.
Yeah, you're
Yep.
back.
Yep, can hear you,
Okay.
Amin.
Yeah, thanks. Okay, so this I always have like really naive, like know nothing questions. So
That's
so
allowed.
you get a tenant for your Power BI tenant, and then your capacity is over in Azure.
Hmm.
And I imagine people could have, capacities in different regions and then Power BI tenants in different regions, right? Like is I think I might have missed something when you were talking. Like if you had, and I don't have this, but if somebody had like different, how would they make sure that the region for their capacity, where their Fabric capacity is in the same place as their Power BI tenant? Or is that a fair question to even ask?
So that's a good question. The answer to that is ultimately so the graphic that I have there on the left, that is the if you go into your Power BI environment and look at your bar at the very top, there's a big question mark in the upper right corner of the screen. You can click on that and then you'll have a link in there that says like about Fabric or about Power BI, depends on the particular UI that you're in. That will give you this particular screenshot that tells you where your Power BI tenant is. As far as Fabric, that's where, like any other Azure resource, when you create it, you define the region that it's going to be in. And that's at least then uh, the nice thing for something like this is at least the Power BI regions and the Fabric capacities, the regions pretty much work the same. So if you find in this case, I have North Central US, Illinois, I could create a Fabric capacity also in Fabric Central or North Central US, Illinois.
Yeah, so I must have done that, setting it up one time like a year ago, and I don't remember.
Yeah. If you go back and you take a look at the capacity in the portal, and I'm trying to think from the UI. So the graphic I hear have here at the lower left as well, that's the workspace. So if you take a look at your workspace settings and where you've got your licensing configured there, if you have a Fabric capacity associated to it, it'll tell you which capacity is associated, and you can kind of see there. In this case, this one's built in North Central US. Does that
All
answer
right.
your question?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Cool. So, and the interesting thing is like talking about this doesn't even include um considerations around like government cloud or private cloud, which I can't even imagine what that looks like right now as far as implementations go. Um, but at least word to the wise is that link, take a look at that, make sure that whatever it says is supported for your region is what you want to use. Peter, you asked a question, what would you recommend if you're in the Midwest? A lot of things that we are building nowadays, I want to say at least we're typically doing um, central US, I think is the data center that's closest to us and is reasonably kept up to date. Sometimes, like this is for my demo environment, I have it set up in North Central US, which if I remember correctly, the data center is a little more outdated there. So sometimes the performance and such isn't the greatest. I could be wrong on that, but I'm pretty sure North Central isn't kept as up to date. I haven't looked at that in a while, so I might be wrong about that. So I'd say typically I'd build it in central US, but again, depends on I'd say where the rest of your Azure tenant infrastructure lives today, and at least keep it in the same region. All right, enough about environment stuff. Let's actually talk features, the actual features themselves. You got an environment, you've licensed it. Fernando's asking, so it depends. Yeah, you know I'm a consultant, right? I have to say it depends. I'm legally obligated to do so. Um, so at least now we've got an environment, we got licensing figured out. Next thing is, all right, we've got this environment, we have no data. So how do we ingest it? I'll start at least with some of the features that are more specific to things that Microsoft would like to encourage you to use because of ease of use, which would be shortcuts and mirroring to try and get data in nice and simple. So let's start with shortcuts. Shortcuts, I'd say things are great. This is a solution that I think is working as advertised, at least in the situations that I've used it. It's easy to populate the environment with data quickly, and I know I use populate loosely there because it's more like a pointer to your source environment than it is actually processing the data over. Although I feel like every time I ask that question from somebody on the Microsoft side, I get a different answer to it. Um, so, but it looks like at least your data is in the environment. So in that respect, getting it up and running nice and quickly, being able to shortcut it without having to write any even low code pipelines or anything like that is really nice. I'd say at least the biggest use case here for shortcuts, if you're considering using this, if you're doing anything with Dataverse and you want your Dataverse data in Fabric, I would highly encourage you to consider shortcutting. I'll say, at least from experience, I've worked on projects that have been 80 plus hours to 100 hours plus, just trying to get a handful of tables from Dataverse into some sort of relational store using something like Azure Data Factory. It works well, but there's a bunch of gotchas, especially with Data Factory and trying to ingest data in. Dataverse doesn't really have that same limitation, at least so far as I've seen. And whereas I spent 80 to 100 hours on that one project, getting a Dataverse link set up to do a shortcut, 15 minutes, maybe half an hour, depending on the number of tables that you are wanting to pull over from Dataverse. The development time, you'll save significantly a lot of time by going that route with this shortcut. Only gotcha I'll encourage here, monitor your source environment impact if you do use shortcutting. As I understand it, shortcutting is essentially using change data capture type features to analyze what's going on in the source environment and to then showcase that in Fabric. Some of the things that I've seen organizations run into is if something like, suppose you're working in Dataverse and you've got a process that creates a transaction in a particular entity, and then after that transaction record is created, you've got other backend processes that are impacting that record and possibly manipulating certain columns that exist there. Each one of those is triggering a change data capture event that the shortcut is going to try and capture. What can happen is it's so busy trying to capture that information, the shortcut slows down the performance of Dataverse to the point that things that are using Dataverse as a back end can start becoming, significant timeouts to becoming unresponsive. So anytime, obviously, that you're doing something like that, replication or otherwise, it's very important to monitor the source environment impact. Shortcuts are the same thing. So just make sure you monitor that up front. Flip to the other side that's a little more relationally structured, and let's talk mirroring. Mirroring, I give it a step back from tag, and actually I give this a room for improvement. And I was hoping with the recent announcements that I would move this from an RFI to a tag, but I'd say at least right now I'm going to keep this still in my middle tier. Why I put it there is that I think for basic scenarios, it works really great. I mean, it's the same sort of replication that a lot of organizations have wanted to use for years. And in that respect, for those basic scenarios, it works great. And especially now that we got the announcement in public preview that it now supports managed instance, the initial implementations when you could only do Azure SQL DB is, for those who use Azure SQL DB, was great. For everybody using managed instance, they're like, hey, I want that cake too, and they couldn't have it. So getting that out there too, I'm really excited to have that announcement. So why do I put it as RFI? There's a couple limitations that if you're planning on using mirroring, make sure you're aware of this, because the documentation doesn't call it out too clearly unless you read it in detail. First thing you want to be careful about is understanding the networking limitations. So at least right now, for Azure SQL DB and for even the preview of managed instance, if you want to set up mirroring right now, it expects that you're going to use a public endpoint to connect into your database environment. So if you like having your public endpoint available, mirroring is an option for you. If you're looking for private endpoints, at least between the Azure SQL DB release and the managed instance preview, you can't use private endpoints, at least not yet. My guess, and obviously I don't have any insight on this, but if I were to guess, the recent announcements talked about on-prem being in private preview for being able to mirror from on-prem environments into Fabric. I'm assuming at least that will solve a number of the issues as far as working with private endpoints. So I would assume it's on the horizon to solve the networking issue, but for right now, if you're looking to implement it today, hopefully you can use a public endpoint. And if you can't, you're going to have to wait for mirroring to implement that for a bit here. Other thing too here, size matters for your source environment. The screenshot I have here is at least when I was initially trying to set up mirroring in my demo environment. And obviously demo environment, I don't have a whole lot of a budget in place. So my Azure SQL DB is fairly small. And I was using the DTU licensing model. In that case, if your source environment is too small, you can't set up mirroring. So I'd have to either increase it to 100 DTUs or last I checked, I believe the vCore licensing model does support mirroring across the board. So it doesn't have the same limitation if vCore makes sense for your licensing model. But if you like the DTU system, make sure at least you have it at an appropriate size, because if you don't, mirroring also is not going to be an option for you. So like mirroring in terms of principle, when I've seen it implemented, it works really good. But this is one of those where right now it's going to be very situational for you on whether you can use it today. I'm very excited when some of these things will change from previews into being generally available. And at that point, I'll at least be easily convinced to move this from an RFI to things are great. So that's at least on the mirroring side. So those are at least the easiest ways to get data into the environment. Next step up, if you're wanting a little bit more complexity and these situations don't work for you, would be low-code solutions. So let's talk data flows. Nice, strong, been around in Power BI for a long period of time. It's been around for a while, but I still have to give this a BTH too. I'll say at least on the Power BI side, I've only used data flows a little bit to get data into Power BI reports. For me, the transition from that to looking at using data flows at an enterprise level for especially what data flows Gen 2 can do is where I start being more critical of it. And that's why at least I give this a lower rating. Some of the things that I think are really good about data flows. The fact that incremental processing was now announced a couple months ago. Now you can pick a specific like date field that is your data flow will take a look at that and it'll identify what has changed recently. Really great feature. The fact that it navigates networks. So what all those things I was talking about with mirroring, where right now private endpoints aren't really an option, data flows can work through that. and it can work in those situations that mirroring can't. Also, big benefit I'd say for them is they're quick to set up. If all you're doing is pulling data from a source, copying it, and pasting it into a lakehouse table, 5-10 minutes to set up one at a time. Really not that big of a deal, depending on how many tables you need to process. And the screenshot I have here too about the dynamic schema. This was something I wasn't aware of until I started working with data flows more regularly in Fabric. It's an interesting feature where when you are expecting schema drift in your source environment, dynamic schema makes it a little bit easier. So if your source environment shifts, you can quickly go into the destination and it will essentially detect that there are changes in the schema and it will update it accordingly. If columns were added, it'll add it into your destination. If columns are removed, it keeps the columns in your destination, but it won't have anything to populate. So then you'll just get null values in that column from here on out. Really, really good features here for data flows and processing data here and there. So I'm saying a lot of positive things, but that doesn't explain BTH. So let me explain BTH. And for me, it's one particular point where I get more critical on this. Flow ownership. Owning these data flows, I know this is kind of the way that I think they worked in Power BI. For enterprise processing of data into something like a data store is, I think, where right now the ownership idea doesn't make sense because all it takes is working in a multi-dev environment. And from experience, I'll tell you the flow ownership gets complicated. For example, if I'm working on a dev team of 3 people and we're all as a group supporting data flows that ingest data from a source environment into Fabric, if I'm not available, I own the flow. Somebody else has to go in and make an adjustment while I'm gone. Depending on the change that's needed to be made, they need to take ownership. When they take ownership, the connection information for the source of the data flow gets wiped out because they want to keep things secure. So then they have to go in and they have to set up the source connection again on top of whatever it was that they needed to do. So I think flows is on edge cases when it's like you're needing to process a table or a particular source and it's kind of a one-off thing. You're not expecting a lot of change and you're not expecting a lot to shift. I don't think it's as big of a deal. But at least early on in implementing Fabric, this was one of the few ways that I found early on that could navigate networks, and that was a requirement that I had in those use cases. Data flows was one of the few ways to do it, and it worked fine as long as you didn't have to touch anything. Um, if they can get if they can change this approach and do something different with the flow ownership and such, I could see this going up rather quickly for some of those edge cases. But for right now, I'd use them more or less for if you need a particular data set for a report or something specific you're trying to do, go ahead and do it. For like enterprise large build outs, I would not advocate using data flows for those use cases. Fernando commented, I found that those changes update after 2 days. Yeah, that sounds about right. Like it's like initially when you read the documentation, it suggests, all right, it's going to detect that the change is there as soon as it's there, and then it will update things. I haven't always found that to be the case too. So if you're saying that is the changes update after 2 days, that would not surprise me. At least the implementations I've done, organizations weren't willing to wait that long. And as soon as suddenly they're like, well, this column should be here. Why isn't it here? We had to update it right away. That's why that dynamic schema setting was really cool, because then at least changing it was only like a 2-3 minute change. Other low code option. So data flows is one, pipelines is the other. Pipelines, I'll give it a tag rating. And I think this is one that is more heavily reliant on what I would encourage for design principles, which for me, usually when I'm doing a build out that involves pipelines, it's more or less for orchestration and for some basic data movement from point A to point B, nothing more than that. And that, I think pipelines and Fabric works really well in that case. Easy for orchestration, regardless of what other things you are using in Fabric. The M365 integration is really cool. Trying to set up uh, error notifications in Azure Data Factory and trying to just send somebody a notification that a process failed meant either using the built-in alerts, which if you read them, they have a lot of words in them. They're not exactly the easiest to read. And if you want something that's a little more tailored to your needs, oftentimes you have to build something outside of Data Factory, which for something like a notification, it'd be nice to have some better options. Fabric Pipelines does have that. You can send emails, you can send Teams notifications. And doesn't necessarily have to be complicated, but that, like, I kid you not, the first demo I saw that and they showed that that was actually one of the biggest features I was most excited about. And I'll say at least having used it, it's delivered on that. It's a small thing, but I think it makes a really big difference. Also, the other thing announced in recent months is the copy job. So situations where you just need to pull data from point A to point B and you're just copying it and you want to do it at scale. If you haven't taken a look at the copy jobs in Fabric, give them a try. I know Wagner's at least made a video on this. I'm pretty sure at least one or two videos. Um, but they're so easy to set up. And actually, compared to, I talked about using data flows for essentially the same function. Initial testing that I've done, copy job to data flows, the copy jobs actually perform a little bit better than a data flow would with the same data. So again, basic copying data from point A to point B and orchestration, pipelines work great. If you're looking to use that and you really like using that type of environment, go for it. It's a good time. Notebooks then moves us from more of the low code to the code side. And at least for notebooks, I'd also give this a tag rating. Notebooks, I don't think there's a whole lot to comment on. At least if you've worked with Jupyter notebooks in the past, you'll like working with notebooks in Fabric. Working in the environment is really easy to do and helps you focus more on the code aspects. Um, the fact that now the UI does support some things with giving you connections to the warehouse. So in the same way we could get that nice drag and drop experience to create data frames from a lakehouse. Now that you can do that with warehouses, I think it opens up a lot of doors where up until that point, only way you could do that is if programmatically you could figure out how to access the warehouse, which for some people, really easy to do. Some people, I think it found it really complicated. And so I think that reduced the user base that would make use of this. I also really like using the notebooks because of the documentation capabilities, the fact that it's Jupyter and that you can do the markdown. If you're doing ETL processes, or if you're a data scientist who's got a advanced script doing profiling, having some more formatted documentation of what you did that are right in the midst of it, I think really fits in well into the Fabric world of, keep everything at your fingertips, focus on what really will make a difference for you as an organization rather than um, trying to figure out how to navigate environments and such. So notebooks, short and easy. I've really enjoyed working with them. Let's see. That's enough about processing data. Let's talk storage. Let's go about lake houses. Lake houses, we're going to keep writing that things are great bandwagon. And I think this is, again, a solution where it's delivering exactly what it prescribes being able to do. Storing data in various formats. So being able to store a bunch of things in that files section of the lakehouse, really nice and easy. And the SQL endpoint, having that available for people who want to write SQL. And it's great for analysis. The thing, at least to be clear about for anybody who's looking to use this, though, and if this makes a determination of lakehouse versus warehouse, keep this in mind. The SQL endpoint for the Lakehouse is intended for really data reading. It's not really meant for data manipulation. So creating tables, updating data in tables, you really can't do that in the SQL endpoint. Most times you're going to have to do that with a notebook or something else that can access the Lakehouse Delta tables themselves. Um, some people I've at least talked to got a little bit confused by that. Um, being able to take unmanaged files, so things like CSV files, and convert them to managed tables that are Delta part or that are Delta format, I think is a really good useful feature. About the only thing I'm not the biggest fan of here is when I've used unmanaged files and using the load tables UI to load into managed, it's a one-time event. It doesn't automatically detect that there's a new CSV file in like your source folder directory and then just update your managed table with that information. You're usually having to write some process to do that. Be really nice if they had something in place where once you define the definition, it's able to take a look at that. But so far, anytime that I've made adjustments to data in the unmanaged section that has a loaded table connected to it, hasn't really updated for me. I don't know if anybody else has had any better luck with this, but that's at least as far as I've gotten. Yeah, yeah, and the whole merging schema, yeah, I ran into that too, Tim. Um, like in principle, it's really good, but for at least considerations around merging, that's about the one reason where I could say, all right, they're trying to protect the table in case somebody tries a file that doesn't match the schema. Um, dropping and creating, that's essentially what we've had to do in our implementations is like drop and create. But there again, like the UI makes it look like, oh, okay, I can load this into a managed table. Hey, I have it set up on a folder directory. Most times when I set up a solution like this, it's going to look at the folder directory. And if it notices new files in there, it's going to magically work for that. Doesn't seem to be the case for that. I don't know if at least I haven't checked if there's an ID on this. If not, I've been planning on submitting one for this because I think that would be a really cool addition to it. Oh, I missed a comment from Fernando. Notebooks are great because of semantic link and semantic link labs alone. Yes, semantic links is great. I'll say actually of the things that I've done with notebooks, I haven't done a whole lot with semantic link yet. That's been on my to-do to research. But I agree with you. Everybody I've talked to about semantic link just has nothing but good things to say about that, and I hope that that continues with the product. See anything else to talk about lake houses? Oh, lake house schemas. I'm pretty sure at least with the recent announcements, I don't think lake house schemas went generally available. Kevin, correct me if I'm wrong on that, but if it didn't, it needs to go generally available because at least anytime I've worked with lake house schemas in preview, it's it's been weird. Like I've been running into weird issue after weird issue after weird issue.
Yeah,
Have you had any exposure to that?
I don't think it's GA yet either. But I'm finding that the schema, the ones with schema are working a whole lot better than they have in the past. There's a couple interesting things that have popped up in the UI. Um, I can't remember
Okay.
which dialogue it is. It's like connect to an existing lake house, and it asks you if it's yeah, connect to a lake house. It says, do you want to do new with schema without there's been a couple interesting things with it. So, but I think they're going to get to be GA soon. And when they become GA, I think that with the schema is going to be the default.
Okay.
That's my prediction.
Yeah, that wouldn't surprise me. At least for as excited as people have been about the feature, I wouldn't be surprised if it went that way too. Um, there's I don't think I have it in the slide deck, but there's at least one gotcha that um was an interesting Microsoft support call I had to work through of working with a notebook trying to access the lake house and it was giving me a forbidden error. Apparently, it was giving me a forbidden error because of something about the version of the lake house schemas themselves. And Microsoft actually had to give me a code snippet that I had to add into my notebooks to basically change the version, and by changing the version, then suddenly it worked. But they told me that at least all of that would be resolved when Lakehouse Schemas goes GA. So if you run into any weird forbidden errors on Lakehouse schemas working with notebooks, let me know. I can help you out with that. Um, but hopefully you don't run into that, and hopefully they go GA with that soon. Flip around to warehouses. So the relational side. Warehouses, I'm gonna say also, things are great. Probably things are great to it's getting close to being room for improvement. Warehouses, it's got the things SQL data people crave, like being able to create simple tables, views, functions, stored procedures. If you're somebody who likes doing all of your ETL processing within the relational environment that your data is stored in, it gives you all the bells and whistles to be able to do that. And it mostly works. The UI, I'll say at least most times nowadays when I'm working with the Fabric warehouses, I just use the SQL endpoint and connect it into it via SSMS. Because right now, at least the warehouse UI, it just depending on what you're trying to do, it takes a lot of time in the UI for things to refresh. And I feel like at least in recent months, the UI has become a little more stable. But like earlier this year, you'd run into some really, really weird errors, both in the UI and just in it itself. Um, this reminds me, at least I'll have to take a look at this to see if this is still an issue. But I posted a video on this earlier this year. Fabric was telling me that I could not insert a null value into a column that accepted null values. Um, Talked to Microsoft about it. Turns out it was actually the error points out the wrong column. It's actually it was genuinely you were inserting a null value into a non-null column, but the error message was calling out the wrong column. It's just kind of a weird circumstance. So that's about at least my biggest critique is the UI. Sometimes the errors are a little bit weird, so just be prepared for that. At least my one encouragement, again, for design principles' sake, if you're looking to do a semantic model based off of your warehouse, create a semantic model that isn't the default semantic model for the warehouse. I think in more recent months, this has gotten better, but early Fabric, if you went and defined relationships within, excuse me, if you defined relationships within the semantic model that was default for the warehouse, it would start adding in constraints into um, the warehouse itself. And especially when you would try to take a look at the base code, or if you try to do anything with source control, sometimes the way it added in the constraints wasn't exactly the prettiest. I haven't tested it more recently, so it might have gotten better, but I'd say also the general rule of thumb I've gotten from Microsoft when talking about this is if you're going to do semantic models off of the warehouse, just create a separate semantic model. Works a little bit easier than using the default. Yeah, we don't need to hear me talk there. All right. Features about processing data. Um, at some point you want to monitor that process. Um, let's see. Tim's asking the question about SQL endpoint views in Git. Tim, are you talking about the endpoint for the lakehouse, or are you talking the warehouse? Because at least both of them allow you to create views.
Correct. So you can create the views, but they're not that I can tell, saved to the repo. So someone can update the views and you're none the wiser. Am I
All
just
right, and
missing
are you
that?
talking, is that the lakehouse endpoint?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, honestly, I actually haven't checked that yet. Any of the times I've been using lake houses, it's been environment specific, and for certain reasons, it didn't make sense to source control them and to move them between environments. So I haven't run into that, but you're saying at least you've added in views and the views don't show up in source control?
That I can see. Because
Okay.
so I
Yeah,
have a client. Go ahead, Kevin.
Yeah, the lake house itself doesn't produce a database project, right? So you're right, they don't show up in source control at all.
Mm,
What I have done is within my Git repo is I've set up my own database project for that lake house, which then I get it to happen from Azure. Yeah, from Azure. Actually, I use Visual Studio Code, but
Mhm.
I've done a little bit with Azure Data Studio as well. And then when I produce my views or whatever, I could do the SQL or the publish, and or if I use Azure Data Studio, that the SQL compare works better, then I could tell if anything's ever changed, or sit there and develop them within my IDE and use the publish process to push them back out. You just got to make sure you don't change any of your tables that show up in that analytics endpoint, because obviously that will fail your publish process.
Yeah, so I have a client that's using Power BI to connect to views. I told them, like, don't mess around with the tables because we reserve the right to change those, but we will bind to the views and keep those up to date. And we were setting up a deployment pipeline, and I noticed that further down in other environments it was failing, and I'm like, what the heck is going on here? And it turns out they changed the view.
Mm.
And so, and I'm like, okay, what's a good way of, managing this across the environments? And so far, the only solution I can see is using Azure Data Studio because Fabric doesn't have that capability natively.
yeah, yeah, and I think I'd head that same direction too. Um, Granted, at least I haven't worked through that specific scenario yet, so I haven't really thought if there's a better approach that I can think of. Fun that at least that you brought up the comment about publishing process and such, Kevin. A little bit here, we'll talk about deployments. So I'll be curious at least for your sentiments on that. Um, Monitoring, we'll go over this fairly quickly. The monitoring capabilities, I'm going to say room for improvement. Big thing here. So Fabric is going to give you that one-stop shop for being able to see everything that's going on in your environment across workspaces. Really good. If you're looking for rudimentary information on that, that's great. Sometimes getting into the details of what exactly is happening in your processes is a little bit convoluted. So I like that it's here in one spot. Sometimes I'd like a little bit of a better UI getting into the details. Bigger thing I'd say though for monitoring, and uh, I'm hoping that at least within this next year this will change because I feel like I'm consistently hearing a lot of people asking for improvements here, is the capacity metrics app and the level of detail you can get about performance in your environment. For those who haven't taken a look at this yet, the line that I have highlighted there is my big pet peeve with monitoring, which is I like doing a lot of things in the warehouse, store procedures, views, etc. When I want to take a look at performance, I can take a look at performance of the warehouse in its entirety, but I can't look at performance of the individual items themselves. So the fact that at least that my duration is high and it's consuming a lot of CU units, I'd have to generally guess what part of either my views, store procedures, and whatnot is taking up that amount. Um, I'm genuinely again hoping that this changes within the next year because consistently when people have talked about monitoring, this has been the area that people would like to see improvement in is can we see more details about the individual processes themselves that are consuming capacity units? And then based on that, can we then understand more about what is actually happening in the engine behind everything that would then help us understand how we need to tune our processes to make them work better. At least setting up the capacity metrics app is really easy to do. So in that respect, it's really a nice addition to have. And especially having the information about bursting and possible throttling due to overages. I like at least that they bring it out there. But the other big criticism here is refreshing the capacity metrics app. We need to do that more frequently. Sometimes I'd like to know the same day that my process is consuming my capacity units, not tomorrow. Be kind of nice. All right. Kevin talked about it a little bit, so let's talk about deployment life cycles. At least for like basics of deployments and like managing code, especially multi-environments, I rank this fairly low. And I think at least basic principle wise, the idea makes sense. In case you haven't looked at the documentation on it, the idea here is if you're working in a multi-developer environment, each of your developers gets their own workspace with a fabric capacity associated to them. They would then also get their own independent branches within a Git repo, and they would at least be able to make their changes. They'd be able to deploy, or they'd be able to um, commit them out into Git. You could do your merging out there, all of that. But then you get to the point of like a development test production environment, and they want you to move to a point where all of those developers' changes goes into centralized development environment, centralized testing environment, centralized production environment. For the most part, the idea makes sense to me. The one thing that doesn't really make sense to me is for things like warehouses. Why can't I pick and choose the specific things I want to deploy in a warehouse? Um, I'm curious, at least, Kevin, if you've at least used the same approach that I have, which I'm actually publishing a video about this tomorrow about how to do deployments of individual objects in a Fabric warehouse. But at least right now, I've had to go the route that I found because right now this doesn't really support if like my warehouse has 5 changes in it, but only like 3 are ready to go, 2 are still being tested. Does that line up at least with your experience, or have you found something different?
No, I mean, the concept you're talking about, you're right on. It's the warehouse type of stuff. We kind of make it that once it gets in, it goes or it gets backed out.
Okay.
And so if it gets backed out, right, through another pull request or whatever that, bug process that you have or whatever. So we don't have to pick and choose. But I need to look a lot more at Kevin Chance things. And now if you're going to publish something, a lot at yours, because I'm getting into having to do a much bigger deployment than I have in the past. So it is kind of challenging. And especially the whole thing about if you change a table, right, and you add a column to it, there's a good chance it's going to drop that table and recreate it. And so now you got to rebuild all your data, which could be a problem. So,
Yeah. Yeah, and that's at least where like
oh, I'm
so the
sorry, didn't I
approach.
say Kevin Chant? Yes, Kevin Chant.
Yeah. So at least the video I'll have coming out on this tomorrow, and I'll say at least it works. It's not pretty, but it works.
Uh-oh. We had him freeze. Hopefully he'll come back in just a second. I'll do some song and dance. I don't know if you could hear my dog crying in the room too, but Oh no.
He's using Teams on Fabric.
He ran out of capacity on his.
He ran out of capacity. That'll teach him.
But, yeah, well, let's overload the queue. Hopefully he'll be able to connect back up in just a second. I have a feeling maybe something went down on his side.
Kevin, do you know when Jared said he's going to post something, does he have like a YouTube channel or something? Do you know what he was talking about?
Yeah, he has a YouTube channel as well. So I could see if I could find that real quick, but okay, you're back. You were gone for a few minutes.
Okay. Sorry about that. Not quite sure what happened. Might have to talk to my kids about their internet usage right now.
They should be in bed.
Like I have a pretty big bandwidth here, so if I'm like they're I don't know what they're doing up there.
Yeah, it's still a little choppy, but I think we could get through it. So yeah, we're um can you
Okay.
post what your YouTube channel is or whatever that you said you got a video coming out tomorrow? And was just asking
Uh,
about that.
sure. I can at least post it in the chat. Otherwise, the last slide I have on here, I'll have a QR code,
Oh,
legitimate
perfect.
QR code that goes to my YouTube channel.
All
But
right.
yeah, the general idea behind it is I'm using the schema compare capabilities in Visual Studio to do the comparison. The generate scripts, it still generates a couple things that expects that you're working in a SQL database environment, so you're going to get some weird errors depending on what type of script it generates. But it's at least aside from what you were talking about there, Kevin, of managing things in Git and pulling things out of that environment before you use the deployment pipeline. This was another approach I've used that at least it works for now. But I'm hoping that at least this changes. I was hoping to get some more announcements about updates to the deployment pipelines these past few weeks, and I didn't really hear anything. So unfortunate.
Yeah, there are supposed to be things coming, I thought relatively soon. Um, but I'm betting on them as well, but I'm starting to kind of go through a lot of the things that others have been doing to find different ways of doing it just in case, because we actually may start our for the big project I got going on. We've been doing it for the last month, 2 months or something like that. We're about ready to go to test and get the business in place. And my first time I could just do it all manually, right? But I want to start really getting something by the end of the year that's going to work. So
Yeah, same. It's I've got projects that are actively moving, and we want to keep production clean because initially we started trying to deploy or just work in a production environment alone, and it wasn't working for obvious reasons. So, but this has at least been the one gotcha is how to easily do deployments. And I think at least for like smaller objects, data flows, or I forget if data flows are supported. But like some
I
of the
think
smaller
data
objects,
flows were just, I thought it came out. I don't know if they pulled it back too, but I did see stuff that they at least announced that it's all supported. And I could have sworn that
okay.
there's
Yeah,
a
I wasn't sure if I
dialogue
saw an
now that
announcement on
says, do
that.
you want to create one that is supported for, it's a weird flow. And I know I haven't been on
Interesting.
any private type of things lately, so I do know that I've seen it um, in the actual set in the actual released area, the public domain.
Gotcha. Yeah, like at least deploying pipelines and other things, the options for the deployment pipelines of like changing for like notebooks, default lake houses and such, that's been nice. But yeah, the warehouses has been the big one where most times we either come up with a significantly different approach to how we're managing our code, or I can't use the deployment pipelines as they're designed. But we'll see if that changes. At
One of the
least
things that
then, oh, go ahead, Tim.
I was going to say, one of the things that I was really looking forward to is if I deploy from one environment to actually invoke a data pipeline, which then can call some notebooks and hydrate data in a whole new environment. And I think they actually added a REST call to finally invoke a data pipeline, if I'm not mistaken.
The deployment pipeline?
Well, no, for a data pipeline, because
Oh, the pipeline object itself.
yeah, because I was like, it would be nice if I could say, okay, deploy this dev environment to stage or test or something like that. And when you get there, fire off these, this data data pipeline, which then will call these notebooks in succession or something like that, or execute
Yeah,
other things to
yeah,
build that environment.
yeah. I had dinner with somebody about a couple weeks ago, and I think he's another MVP, and I think he gave that feedback to him as well. right? And I've heard others on some other calls talk about it would just be nice if, like you said, you could execute this deployment pipeline. And when the part of the deployment pipeline is call these, do these calls after, say a post call and a pre-call,
Yeah.
right? And so your post call, like you said, you might have a notebook that is going to do some, I don't know, set up your schema for you in the lake house or something to make sure it's the way you want it to be, type of thing. So yeah, it would be nice. I hope that's going to be coming out.
Yeah. Otherwise, there's a
Same.
lot of manual steps.
Yep.
Yes, yes, very much. Right with you on that. All right. Let's see. That's enough about that. I think then last thing I talk about is really about the community. And this is again where, like, okay, technically this isn't a feature Fabric, but I'll say within the full ecosystem of Fabric, and in my mind, what Fabric needs to succeed, it's a strong part of that. And I'll say at least so far, community is really rallying around the product, and I think that's what we're going to need. You asked me about like Power BI and a lot of the success that it's gotten within coming up on like 10 years since it was initially implemented. A lot of the reasons of where it's gotten to where it is today is because of community engagement and how the community held Microsoft accountable for this kind of product and what it needs to be. And right now, I think the reassuring thing is for as quickly as Fabric is growing, you're seeing that same community engagement here. There's been a number of community events just within this past year. We've got now a global online conference that started up. Products within its first year, and already we have a global online event. You've got FabCons going on that's got community involvement, YouTube channels and such like the Fabric Cafe. A lot of communities are quickly jumping in and are presenting content on Fabric. User groups like this are actively including the discussion on that, and we're sharing information here that then can turn into ideas out on the ideas page. And I feel like every time I take a look at the ideas page on Fabric, like day in and day out, it's the ideas are changing every day, and there's just more being added in and added in and added in. And as long as Microsoft can sift through all of that, obviously is the other side of it, but at least the community is jumping out there and they've got ideas about how to make the product better. And I think that's at least going to be the biggest thing here is the community is going to need to continue to engage and to hold this platform to a standard. Um, yeah, apply. Yeah, very good, Tim. Yeah, apply Copilot against the ideas. Like, yeah, summarize what everybody's concerned about and what everybody wants to do, more so than just getting a dark theme in the UI. Um, so this is at least just kind of the nice way to round things out from my lens is the community, I think, is right where it needs to be. And as long as we keep engaged as a community, um, to share our ideas, to give feedback, to tell Microsoft what we want this product to be. I'm really excited to see where this product ends up in 5 years. Like I'll say this past year working in this product, probably the most fun I've had as a data engineer, at least probably for most of my career, if not my entire career. This has been the most exciting thing, is just seeing this product grow and evolve and working with it. So that brings us up. So there's our quick summary slide of things. So a lot of really good things to be thankful for that are really working well. Number of areas that are kind of on the verge of achieving that greatness already in first year. Couple things that it's got room to grow. But again, that's where at least the community is going to need to come into it. We need to be vocal about the same sorts of things that we're talking about here. As long as we do that, I have high hopes for what year two in the future looks like. So getting into the Christmas season, I'll at least share with you my wish list of things that I'm hoping for the product. And for others, this is where I'd love to hear others' thoughts about what you'd like to see out of it. For me personally, a lot of the things that we were just talking about with deployments, there needs some to be some improvements there, especially for support for the warehouses and that life cycle. I imagine for a lot of organizations that might consider migrating workloads over to Fabric, Fabric's going to be an easy target for that. And if we can't effectively deploy things, I think it's going to be hard to get people into that idea. The warehouse UI, some of the refreshing, dark theme in the UI. Come on, we finally got it in SSMS after like 20 years. I hope we don't have to wait 20 years to get that in Fabric as well. I like me a little bit of dark theme, so it'd be nice to have that there. Um, One other thing I was hoping for, didn't hear it this time, Copilot licensing. So at least the one thing I didn't talk about is is uh the fact that Copilot, at least the baked in Copilot into the product, is only for F64 SKUs and higher. Um, I thought I heard some rumblings that at least at some point that might change, and I think right now, I'd be interested to see some opportunities where that Copilot can be available as a license for smaller SKUs. Um, in at least some sort of licensing model that even just makes it an option versus just going up to a higher fabric SKU in its entirety. Um,
Yeah, I kind of like that, but it also makes it a little more confusing too, right?
yeah. Oh, for sure.
Because yeah, because you gotta go, you already have the and your whole comment about licensing in the beginning was, I think, spot on, and it carries over just from Power BI in itself. A lot of people get very easily confused about licensing. But then when you go, okay, now you could have a F2 capacity and pay $10 extra per user for Copilot.
Hmm.
you know, and then go, oh, plus you got to have another $10 per user to publish a report.
Right.
And yeah, you're gonna have all those different things that'll make it even more confusing. So
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, yeah, and I agree with you there. Like I don't know what the licensing model should look like there. I mean, I know at least for me, like the closest I've gotten is I'm now working in environments that can afford the F64. So about the only Copilot support that I can get right now is using like a GitHub Copilot and basically feeding it context of like this is generally how Fabric works, even though it has no visibility to how Fabric works, and trying to see if at least it can come up with some insight on what could work. Gets you in the ballpark, yes, but is it going to truly make best use of the product versus using the copilots baked into Fabric? I would assume no. So I agree, at least it would make the licensing model more complicated and they'd have to figure that out. But right now, man,
see now
I
there
can't tell you
there
the number of situations I've been in. I would really like to have access to that copilot.
yeah, there would be a good thing. I don't know if they could integrate the two, but because I use the GitHub Copilot as well, right? And yeah, I could, like you said, you could prompt it a certain way. Or if you're just looking for the generic Python way or SQL way, Spark
Mhm.
SQL, right? You could set, that I've had great success with. I've had pretty decent success saying if I need it specifically something for Fabric and, but then take what you learn from it. But if you could take, say, you already bought a GitHub Copilot and say, let me use my license while I'm in the Fabric UI on the service, I doubt that's going to happen
Yeah.
because, they're two separate licensing platforms,
Yeah.
but that
Oh
would be
yeah, yeah.
cool.
Well, and I feel like there's got to be some answer on the horizon because the other situation that I wonder how this is going to work or if it's just going to be sorry, it's not going to work at all is I mentioned earlier about being able to use SSMS with connecting to like Fabric Warehouse endpoints and doing things in there. Well, now SSMS 21 has, at least in private preview, a Copilot where you can provision an Azure OpenAI service. Um, and at least the idea, as I understand it, is you'll be able to connect it into your SSMS, and then when you connect to database environments, the Copilot will at least get some context into what you have access to into those database environments. So that's another situation where you'd almost get that support, at least for the warehouse, but not using the Copilot that's native to Fabric. How that looks, I don't know, but it just raises a lot of questions for me.
Yeah, that's true.
Um,
Anybody else? Let's see, Fabric gift cards.
Fabric gift cards. Don't you think Fabric's great? The one lake thing is what makes it future proof. Actually, yeah, that's the other thing. Actually getting a formal definition of one lake itself. Like in principle, they talk about it, but the one thing that's always bothered me about the idea of one lake is the definition of one lake and the way that they're selling it to me says, okay, so there's a way that I can put data in the one lake that isn't tethered to a workspace necessarily, and then I can like shortcut it into various areas, and that's how it would distribute things. But so far, getting data into the environment means you're bringing it into a workspace, a lake house, event house, warehouse, something like that, and then it lives in one lake. So like the one lake premise exists, but I don't really have a way of just like interacting with the one lake itself without context of a workspace. It's really nitpicky. I get persnickety about these sorts of things sometimes, but it's just the one thing that it hasn't fully made sense to me. Fabric gift cards would be good though. The nice little logo on there and everything. Anybody else at least have anything you're looking for out of the product?
Jared, I just want to thank you for your talk. I mean, it's like you do a fantastic job going through this and explaining it really clearly and just entertaining at the same time. So thank you.
Well, honestly, that's like the highest praise I can get him on because like when I talk as presenting, like I have two objectives. One is like obviously teaching you some things and showcasing things that people haven't thought of yet. Second goal I have as always is to not be boring because because I think at least we want to make data fun, and that's honestly again why I say this is like the most I've enjoyed my career working with Fabric this year is because I feel like Fabric has helped make data fun again, and that's what I'd love to do more in the community is let's make it fun. That's part of the reason why we want to do scientific inquiry and do all this stuff with data in the first place is it's kind of fun, it's kind of nerdy, so let's keep riding that train. So much appreciated for that feedback. And that does bring me to the end of things and at least a final slide for QA considerations. But I know we've already talked a bit. Some people were asking about the YouTube channel. So if you hit that QR code there on the screen, that'll go to my YouTube channel called DataBard. Um, right now I'm doing a lot of content on Fabric on various things. Like I said, I have the video for tomorrow. On my approach to working with deployments of Fabric warehouses. I've got some other things out there for working with like notebooks and I forget what else. Um, Otherwise, if you want to connect in with me on social, my primary ones are LinkedIn. It's probably the easiest way to get a hold of me. Or somebody encouraged me to go take a look at Blue Sky, and I'm going to give that a shot. So I've got that out there as well. Feel free to connect with that. And again, this is just end of year one, but this product's going to keep going. I honestly might keep doing this as like a year two, year three, year four. We'll see. But in any case, I'm wanting to be part of the community that helps educate and helps push this product to where I think it can go. So if you have any questions, any other weird things that you've run into on Fabric, and you're looking for an outside perspective, by all means, reach out. I'd be happy to go research, see if I can break Fabric. I've been really trying to break Fabric, and I haven't had a good use case. I've had one close use case. I just haven't found a good way to automate it yet. But the closest break I've had is at least the one error video that I had earlier. But I'm hoping that that video is like 6 months old, so I'm hoping they fix that. I'm gonna go and test it right now and find out that they still haven't fixed it yet. In which case, look at my video, get it fixed. No, just kidding. Any other questions, comments, anything else you want to pick my brain on? At least what part of my brain is exposed from outside of my hat.
Yeah, feel free to put it in the chat, raise your hand, come off mute. Otherwise, we'll start wrapping this thing up. Go ahead, Tim.
I accidentally hit the wrong thing. I was going to put a reaction of clapping there.
There you go.
All good,
All
all
right.
good.
Let me go ahead and turn the recording off.
Yeah. Hey, I was sort of running around